The winter air is thin and sharp, drifting through the rural edges of northeast Philadelphia, where empty fields meet narrow, winding roads. Before the city's expansion transformed this part of Pennsylvania, Fox Chase was a patchwork of quiet woods, small farms, and a scattering of old houses that seemed to stand farther apart than they truly were. It was peaceful, unassuming, the sort of place where nothing loud or terrible was expected to happen. And yet, in February of 1957, something would appear here. Something small enough to fit inside a cardboard box, yet heavy enough to haunt generations. The box itself was ordinary, the kind meant to ship a household appliance. Its edges were softening from the winter damp. Its placement near the roadside brush could have been dismissed as trivial. Litter from a passing truck, a leftover scrap from a nearby home, another piece of debris lost in a cold, uncaring wind. But there was a stillness in the air around it, a silence that didn't belong, as though the landscape itself understood what rested inside long before any human eye discovered it. When the box was finally noticed, the moment passed quietly. No crowd gathered, no panic followed. There was no frantic call from a frantic family, no desperate search that crossed paths with the discovery. There was only the stark, lonely truth of what lay within. A young boy, estimated to be between 3 and 7 years old, lying carefully, yet hauntingly, inside the discarded container. He had no identification, no clothing, no note, no object that connected him to a life lived somewhere outside those woods. Most striking of all, he had no one, no mother searching for him, no father demanding answers, no missing persons alert that resembled him. He seemed to appear out of nowhere, with nothing but questions surrounding him. This was a child who should have been loved, a child who should have had a name whispered by someone who cared for him. But in those first hours, he was simply a tragedy without a story, a victim without a voice. News traveled with unsettling speed. Philadelphia police would soon arrive, experienced men suddenly faced with a scene that felt unbearably personal. They didn't yet know how complicated the search for truth would become, how many years would pass without clarity, or how deeply this case would carve itself into the identity of the city. They only knew that a boy had been found, and nobody knew who he was. He would come to be called America's Unknown Child, a title that captured both the sorrow of his story and the national attention it would soon draw. But before the headlines, before the investigations, before decades of theories and false leads, he was simply a child, lying in the cold, waiting for someone to notice that he existed. The cardboard box that held him was not just a container. It was the beginning of one of the most haunting mysteries in American history, a mystery that would stretch across generations, evade countless investigators, and resist every forensic tool available for more than 6 decades. Because this story was never just about a crime. It was about a search for identity, a search for belonging, a search for the truth behind a child who had been hidden in silence and found by chance. For 65 years, this boy would remain nameless, faceless, a symbol etched into true crime history. And yet, in 2022, the silence finally broke. But before we reach that moment, before the return of a name lost to time, we go back to where it began, back to Fox Chase, back to the cold winter woods, back to the discovery that shook Philadelphia and launched one of the longest-running investigations the city would ever face. A mystery hidden inside a cardboard box. The place where the box was found was not the kind of location that drew attention. A narrow stretch of Susquehanna Road, quiet, unpaved in sections, bordered by patches of tangled brush and thin woods, formed a landscape more familiar to wandering animals and passing cars than to anyone walking with purpose. In winter, the trees stood bare and brittle, their branches etched against the gray sky like lines drawn in haste. The air carried that particular cold of February in Pennsylvania, clean, muted, and strangely hollow. Sound seemed to fall flat here, swallowed by the stillness of the woods. Only the soft rustle of wind through dead leaves gave the area the faint illusion of movement. It was here, in this quiet and sparsely traveled stretch, that the cardboard box rested. It had been discarded in a way that didn't immediately raise suspicion, lying just beyond the edge of the road, partly tucked into the undergrowth. At a glance, it could have been nothing more than packaging material tossed aside, the kind of thing that sometimes ended up along rural roadsides. But when someone looked closer, the details shifted from ordinary to unsettling. The box itself was a standard carton once used to ship a bassinet, an irony that would haunt investigators for decades. The flaps were open, not neatly sealed. Inside, laid with a level of care that contrasted sharply with the circumstances, was the small body of a young boy. He appeared between 3 and 7 years old, his features delicate, his expression still. There was no sign of a struggle nearby, no discarded belongings that offered clues, no tracks that remained clear once the winter winds had swept through the woods. The ground, hardened by cold, preserved little. But the investigators who arrived at the scene noted everything they could. The boy's hair appeared to have been recently cut, almost crudely so, as if done in haste. He was wrapped in a blanket, worn, thin, and unmistakably old. There were no labels, no initials, no identifying marks that could tie it to a home or a caretaker. Everything present at that scene felt deliberate, yet nothing led anywhere. Officers searched the surrounding area carefully but respectfully, aware of the weight of what they were documenting. They checked the brush, the creek bed, the nearby properties. They looked for footprints, tire tracks, dropped items, anything that could speak when the child could not. But the woods were silent. There were no witnesses who had seen the box placed there, no neighbors who had reported suspicious vehicles, no cries heard in the night. The road, bordered by woods on both sides, offered more concealment than clarity. Cars passed infrequently. People rarely walked there. Whatever happened, happened unseen. The geography of the scene worked against the investigation from the beginning. The emptiness that normally made the area peaceful now created a vacuum. No cameras, no homes facing the road, no pedestrians, no chance encounters that could offer a thread of truth. By the time investigators lifted the cardboard box and carried it from the woods, one fact was painfully clear. This was not going to be a case that resolved itself. The boy had been left with nothing that pointed back to a life he once lived. No clothing to trace, no personal belongings to examine, no name to anchor the search. Just a small body in a weathered box. A discovery that stunned the people who found him and soon an entire city. From this quiet patch of Philadelphia woods, the mystery of the boy in the box began. An investigation that would grow into one of the most perplexing and enduring cases in American history. When the call reached Philadelphia police, it carried the heavy uncertainty of a discovery that no officer ever wants to hear. A child found alone, lifeless, with no immediate explanation. Within minutes, patrol cars made their way toward Fox Chase, their tires crunching over the cold winter ground as officers stepped into the quiet stretch of Susquehanna Road that would soon become one of the most examined locations in American true crime history. The first investigators arrived to a scene that felt strangely untouched, as if time itself had paused out of respect. The cardboard box remained exactly where it had been found, resting in the brush beside the narrow roadway. Officers noted the surroundings immediately. The sparsely settled area, the thin woods offering both concealment and exposure. The lack of clear tracks or disturbances that might point to a direction, a struggle, or a hurried departure. Everything felt deliberate, yet nothing revealed intent. The boy was carefully removed from the box and examined with measured, solemn professionalism. His age was estimated between 3 and 7 years old, difficult to narrow further given his size, condition, and lack of identifying information. The investigators who knelt beside him were seasoned, but the sight of such a young child would remain with them for the rest of their careers. One of the earliest realizations was the absence of clothing. Without garments, investigators lost critical opportunities. Fabric types, laundry marks, retail sources, fibers or personal items that might have hinted at where he lived, what he owned, or who cared for him. Every detail that might have offered direction seemed deliberately removed before he was placed into the box. His haircut, uneven and clearly recent, caught immediate attention, not because it pointed to guilt or innocence, but because it was one of the only visible clues. It suggested someone had been tending to him shortly before his death. Someone had taken the time, if not gently, then assertively, to cut his hair. That single fact kept early investigators turning the same question over and over. Where was the person who last cared for this child? The blanket in which he had been wrapped was collected as evidence. It was old, frayed at the edges, faded in places from years of use. Its pattern was simple, unremarkable. Investigators studied it for tags, embroidery, or anything that might tie it to a household. But like everything else in this mystery, the blanket offered no answers. Officers expanded the search to the surrounding area. They combed the woods and roadside meticulously, walking slowly, shoulder to shoulder in grid formation. They examined ditches, scanned the creek bed, inspected tire ruts on the dirt roadway, and looked for signs of a vehicle turning around or stopping. They found nothing definitive. The absence of evidence was not merely challenging, it was alarming. Even in cases where a body is abandoned, there are usually mistakes, a dropped object, a set of footprints, an overlooked clue that creates a starting point. Here, the woods provided no such gift. If the child had been placed there discreetly, it had been done with extreme caution. If it had been placed there hurriedly, then nature had erased the traces. When detectives returned to headquarters, the boy's description was broadcast across multiple precincts. Notifications went out to surrounding counties. Philadelphia police expected, hoped, for a missing child report that had simply not yet been connected. The city was large. Nearby towns were smaller but numerous. Somewhere, they believed, someone must have reported a boy of this age missing. But as hours passed, the phone lines remained silent. When missing persons logs were checked, not a single report matched him. No child in the region or in neighboring states fit his age, his features, or his description. Hospitals were contacted, local schools were alerted, orphanages and foster homes and juvenile agencies were reviewed within the first day. Still nothing. That silence grew louder with every passing hour. By the end of the first night, investigators understood something chilling. This boy did not appear in any system designed to protect children. No parent had called to report him gone. No guardian had stepped forward in fear or grief. No one seemed to know he was missing, or worse, no one chose to say they did. This shifted the investigation from tragedy to mystery. It introduced a new kind of fear, the possibility that his identity had been deliberately hidden, not lost. Seasoned detectives stood in the dim lights of the police station, staring at the few photographs taken that day. Photographs that would, later, become famous across the country. Photographs intended not to sensationalize, but to give this child the dignity of recognition, something he had been desperately denied. In those first hours, the case stopped being routine. It stopped being local. It stopped being something investigators thought they could resolve quickly. Instead, it became clear that this would not be a simple case at all. It was the beginning of a search that would last decades, span generations of police work, and defy every method investigators had at their disposal. A search for a name. A search for a story. A search for a truth, buried deeper than the cold February woods where he was found. In the days that followed the discovery, Philadelphia found itself drawn into a collective moment of grief. One that grew not from the details of the crime, but from the painful absence of them. A young boy had been found, alone in the cold, with nothing to tell the world who he was. That absence of a name, of a family, of the simplest record of a life lived, became the central wound that the city could not ignore. For investigators, this was more than a case file. For the community, it was more than a headline. It became a quiet heartbreak that settled into the conscience of Philadelphia. Newspapers picked up the story almost immediately, publishing respectful, carefully worded articles describing the boy's appearance, his estimated age, and the mysterious circumstances under which he had been found. His face appeared in black and white photographs, somber images meant to bring recognition, not shock. Editors debated how much to show, how much to reveal, striving to balance public awareness with human dignity. Readers reacted with sorrow. Letters arrived at newsrooms and police headquarters from residents who could not bear the thought of a child passing through life unnoticed and then through death unloved. People asked if he might belong to a family that had moved away. They asked if he might have come from out of state. They asked if perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, a child missing but never reported correctly, a clerical error, a lost message. But the answer, again and again, was silence. The lack of a name weighed heavily. Cities are accustomed to noise, traffic, voices, commotion. But the silence surrounding this child became its own kind of echo. Even people who had no children of their own, people far removed from Fox Chase or police work, found themselves thinking about him. A child without a name challenges something fundamental in the human spirit. It feels wrong, unnatural, unfinished, something that should never happen. The phrase, "America's unknown child," began to appear, first as a local expression, then as a headline repeated across state lines. It captured the essence of the tragedy. This was no longer just a Philadelphia mystery. It belonged to the entire country. Because the collective hope was that somewhere, someone would see the boy's picture and understand who he was. Police received calls from as far away as the Midwest. People comparing his features to a relative they had once lost contact with, or to a child rumored to have been taken in custody battles or family disputes. But none of these leads matched. None brought clarity. As the story grew, Philadelphia residents began leaving flowers and notes at the police station. Some people sent small donations specifically intended for the burial of the boy, wanting him to rest with dignity even if the world never learned his identity. Others asked if they might attend his funeral when the time came, hoping that presence, human presence, could stand in for the family he was denied. Police officers who normally maintained a certain professional distance found themselves moved in ways they had not expected. Some described later how the case felt personal from the beginning, how the boy's face lingered in their thoughts long after they returned home, how the uncertainty around him created a kind of emotional fatigue they rarely experienced. The child became a symbol not of fear or sensational tragedy, but of vulnerability, of how easily a life can slip into the margins when no one speaks for it. Journalists, too, felt the weight. Some kept copies of his photograph on their desks for years, hoping that one day a story would cross their path that connected back to him. Others continued to write follow-up pieces as anniversaries passed, ensuring the public never forgot the boy who had been found in the cardboard box. To the people of Philadelphia, he was no longer a mystery to solve. Not solely. He was a child who deserved remembrance. He was a promise, a quiet vow shared by detectives, reporters, and residents alike, that they would not let him disappear into history without a fight. He became a face that filled bulletin boards and police briefing rooms, a name that grew heavier in its absence, a reminder that even in a city as large and complex as Philadelphia, the smallest life could move the greatest number of hearts. This was America's unknown child, a boy waiting for someone, somewhere, to recognize him.
In the aftermath of the discovery, Philadelphia police launched what would become one of the most exhaustive identity searches in the city's history. The goal was simple, but impossibly difficult. Find out who this boy was. Give him a name. Connect him to a family, a neighborhood, a story. Restore to him the basic truth every child deserves. But the deeper investigators went, the more they realized just how alone this boy truly was. The first step was canvassing. Officers moved through Fox Chase and its surrounding neighborhoods with photographs, knocking on doors, speaking with families, and asking the same heartbreaking question: do you recognize this child? People studied the images carefully, some with shock, some with sorrow, some with denial in their eyes. Yet no one could identify him. No one remembered seeing him. No family reported a missing boy matching his description. The absence of recognition became a grim sign. Door-to-door efforts expanded beyond Fox Chase, reaching into the city and then beyond it. Police walked row house blocks in North Philadelphia, visited suburban homes in Montgomery County, and even extended inquiries to rural towns in neighboring states. Officers entered shops, diners, service stations, anywhere people might gather. They showed the boy's picture and waited for even the smallest spark of familiarity. It never came. At the same time, hospitals, clinics, and medical centers were contacted. Investigators hoped that someone, anyone, might recall treating a young boy with the identifiable physical characteristics noted during his examination. Doctors combed through records and spoke with staff. Pediatricians reviewed old files, trying to match medical markers or injuries. The hope was that, even without a name, the child's medical history could provide a thread to pull. But every file came up empty. Orphanages and foster homes were next. Pennsylvania's social services system was contacted in full, and parallel checks spread to New Jersey, Delaware, and New York. Supervisors, caregivers, and administrators reviewed rosters, intake lists, and departure records. These institutions were used to children arriving abruptly and sometimes disappearing just as suddenly due to reassignments, adoptions, or reunifications. Investigators believed that if the boy had slipped through the cracks anywhere, it might have been here. Yet no orphanage recognized him. No foster home reported a child missing. No institution claimed responsibility. Thousands of flyers were printed, simple sheets with the boy's photograph and a plea for information. Police hand-delivered them to businesses, pinned them on bulletin boards, and distributed them at city transit stops. The flyers traveled far beyond Philadelphia. Truck drivers carried them across state lines. Postal employees shared them with colleagues. Travelers picked them up and took them home. A nation began to look at the face of a boy no one could name. Doctors, too, played a crucial role. More than a dozen medical professionals, specialists in pediatrics, dentistry, and general medicine, examined the boy or photographs of him. They studied his growth markers, dental structure, past injuries, and small details that could reveal where he lived or how he was cared for. Some noted signs of previous medical treatments. Others noted features that were uncommon enough that a physician who had seen him before might remember him. But when doctors across the region were contacted, none came forward with certainty. the boy remained unclaimed. Officers returned to their evidence: the blanket, the haircut, the cardboard box. Every item was scrutinized. The box had once contained a bassinet sold in stores across the East Coast, but the distribution was too broad to identify a single purchaser. The blanket lacked any tags or distinguishing marks. The haircut, though unusual, revealed nothing concrete. Weeks passed, then months, and still no child matching his description appeared in any state's missing persons database. For investigators, this lack of progress was more than discouraging. It was chilling. Missing children are reported. Families search. Neighbors notice absence. Schools ask questions. Hospitals report concerns. But here was a child whose disappearance seemed to exist in a void. Some detectives feared that the boy had lived his life quietly, perhaps isolated, perhaps hidden. Others wondered if he had come from far away, moved, transferred, uprooted before the final journey to Philadelphia. Still others considered that whoever had cared for him had chosen not to report him missing. None of these thoughts were spoken lightly, and none were treated as fact. But as every institutional check ended in silence, the implications grew heavier. The search was relentless, thorough, and unprecedented for its time. Thousands of hours were spent following leads that evaporated as quickly as they appeared. Investigators worked late nights, reviewing lists, cross-referencing records, hoping for a detail that would break the silence. But in those early years, the silence only deepened. The boy, despite the efforts of an entire city, remained unidentified, present in the public eye, yet erased from every known record. A child seen by millions, yet recognized by no one. He became a mystery the community could not let go. The search for his identity, though it brought no answers, cemented something deeper, a shared commitment that this child would not be forgotten, that his face, once found in the cold, would remain etched into Philadelphia's memory, that the search would not end, not even decades later.
As the months turned into years and the case refused to break, something inevitable began to happen. Theories, many of them sincere, some of them far-fetched, started to spread. They grew from frustration, from compassion, from desperation, and from a city wrestling with the idea that a child could simply appear without a past. Each theory carried its own set of believers, its own internal logic, and its own weight. And yet, none of them were ever proven. The earliest theories focused on the institutions that cared for children. Investigators wondered if the boy might have come from an orphanage, especially one known for strict discipline or limited oversight. Several facilities were examined closely. Their records were checked, their staff interviewed, their children accounted for. One particular orphanage, located not far from where the boy was discovered, drew years of public speculation. People questioned whether a child there might have passed away and been concealed out of fear or shame. But despite extensive review, authorities never uncovered evidence linking the boy to any such facility. The theory remained a possibility in the public imagination, but not in the case file. Another theory pointed toward a foster family, a home where many children had come and gone, sometimes without meticulous documentation. Because the boy's haircut appeared freshly done, and because he showed signs of having been cared for in some respects, people wondered whether he had lived under a roof where he was hidden from wider society. Investigators interviewed numerous foster parents, reviewed state records, and followed up on anonymous letters and comments that circulated over the years. Nothing solid ever surfaced. Every potential lead dissolved under scrutiny. Rumors also emerged about child trafficking, a term that, in the 1950s, was rarely used publicly, but nonetheless existed beneath the surface of society. People speculated that the boy might have been taken across state lines, moved quietly, and abandoned when circumstances changed. These ideas were often driven not by evidence, but by fear. Fear that something larger and more sinister had taken place. But again, investigators found no proof. There were no known rings or patterns that matched the boy's case. Nothing connected. Some theories centered around the summer cottages and seasonal housing, common in and around Fox Chase at the time. Families from other regions often spent only part of the year in Philadelphia, leaving quickly once the season ended. Could the boy have belonged to one of them? Had a family arrived, faced tragedy, and departed without saying a word? Officers tried tracking property owners and long-term renters. Many were contacted years after the fact, but no records produced a family missing a boy of his age. As decades passed, the reach of the case expanded far beyond Pennsylvania. Tips came in from across the country, suggesting the boy might have been from Florida, Ohio, or even the West Coast. Some people referenced newspaper clippings of missing children they remembered from towns long left behind. Investigators checked each possibility, no matter how remote. None matched. The absence of answers became fertile ground for conjecture. Writers, amateur detectives, and even those who simply carried a heavy emotional investment in the case proposed scenarios. Theories multiplied not because people wanted to sensationalize the boy's story, but because they wanted to imagine any path that might lead to resolution. Still, the Philadelphia Police Department held firm to the facts. They cataloged every theory, documented every suggestion, and pursued only what could be substantiated. They refused to endorse speculation, not out of stubbornness, but out of respect for the boy and the integrity of the case. If a theory couldn't be supported by evidence, it remained a theory, nothing more. But one truth became clear. The longer the investigation remained unsolved, the more the boy's identity faded behind the layers of possibility. It was as if every new theory created another fog through which investigators had to peer, hoping to spot a detail that might finally reveal his past. Through it all, the case stood still. No fingerprints matched. No family came forward. No records emerged. No theory rose above the others with enough clarity to direct the investigation. The boy in the box remained a mystery suspended between numerous possibilities, each carefully considered, each ultimately unproven. And as each theory quieted, only one question remained louder than ever. Who was he? Not who might have harmed him, not where he could have lived, not what others imagined his life to be, but who he truly was. This question would linger for the next generation of investigators, and the generation after that. A question no theory could satisfy. A question that demanded truth, not speculation. A truth that would not come for 65 years. As the investigation entered the 1960s and then the 1970s, the intensity of public attention never truly disappeared. It simply transformed. With the case gaining national visibility and the boy's face printed in newspapers, flyers, detective journals, and eventually even true crime books, tips began pouring in from every direction. Some were sincere, some were hopeful, some were delusional, and some were intentionally misleading. But each one demanded the same treatment, a careful, methodical search for truth. The first wave of tips came from within Philadelphia. Neighbors called, convinced that a family down the street acted suspiciously or that a child nearby resembled the boy before he vanished from view. Detectives followed each lead, driving from home to home, comparing photographs, verifying children's identities, and speaking with parents who were understandably startled by the sudden inquiries. Each time the outcome was the same. Every child was accounted for. But as the story spread beyond Pennsylvania, the the tips grew broader and more difficult to verify. People claimed to have seen the boy on buses, in train stations, or at roadside diners weeks before his discovery. Some believed he resembled a child from a missing persons poster hundreds of miles away. Investigators contacted jurisdictions across multiple states, only to find that no disappearance aligned with the boy's characteristics or timeline. A particularly challenging category of tips came from individuals who insisted they could identify him through memory alone. These were people who believed the boy looked like a relative they had not seen in years, or a neighbor's child who moved away abruptly. Even when the logic of the tip seemed thin, police pursued it. They owed the child that much. But again, every lead dissolved once records, birth certificates, or living children were accounted for. As the case grew older, another group began to emerge: psychics. Though investigators never relied on clairvoyant input, psychics contacted the police with elaborate visions of who the boy was, where he lived, and how he had died. Their stories varied wildly, detailed narratives that often contradicted each other and contradicted known facts. Some arrived in person at the police station, offering sketches or descriptions they claimed were divinely inspired. Investigators listened politely, documented the statements, and then returned to the evidence-based work that alone could solve the case. Then came the false confessions. Over the decades, several individuals stepped forward to claim responsibility for the boy's death or to assert that they knew what happened to him. Confessions, whether rooted in guilt, mental illness, or a desire for notoriety, are not uncommon in high-profile unsolved cases. But for investigators, each confession presented a burden. They couldn't dismiss any claim outright. Every statement had to go through the same rigorous process of verification. Detectives met with these individuals, recorded their stories, and compared their statements against previously established facts. Where the timeline didn't match, the details were impossible, or the claims referenced information never made public, inconsistencies piled up quickly. No confession ever aligned with the evidence. Not a single one provided verifiable knowledge about the boy, the location, the items at the scene, or the timeline. With each false lead and each confounding claim, the case grew heavier. Detectives spent thousands of hours pursuing information that ended in disappointment. The emotional fatigue was real. Investigators later described the experience as a constant cycle of rising hope followed by inevitable collapse. One lifelong detective would recall how the case seemed to attract noise of every kind, an overwhelming hum of voices, ideas, accusations, and impressions that distracted from the faint signals investigators desperately needed. Sorting truth from fiction became an ongoing challenge, a daily discipline, and a painful reminder that the more famous a case becomes, the harder it is to hear genuine truth over the echoes of speculation. Still, the police kept going. They archived every lead. They documented every interview. They preserved every scrap of information, no matter how improbable, because they understood something essential about cold cases. Time can make previously meaningless clues suddenly valuable. What seemed irrelevant in 1960 might prove meaningful in 1980. What felt like noise in 1990 might align with forensic advances in 2000. And so the case file grew. Boxes of documents, stacks of photographs, envelopes of letters, handwritten notes from tipsters, and transcripts of statements that led nowhere. The physical weight of the file mirrored the emotional weight carried by detectives who refused to give up. Through all of this, one truth remained unchanged. No tip brought the boy closer to being identified. No confession linked him to a known family. No story explained his presence in the Philadelphia woods. Each dead end added another layer to the mystery, another reminder that even the most dedicated pursuit of truth can be hindered by shadows. Shadows created not only by the original tragedy, but by the noise that followed. And yet, investigators continued to hope, because among the countless false paths, they believed there might be one true lead, small, fragile, and quiet, waiting to be found. A lead that would eventually come, but not yet. As the decades passed and the case persisted stubbornly without resolution, one account rose above the noise, not because it was verified, but because it was detailed, emotional, and delivered with unwavering conviction by the woman who told it. She became known publicly only as M. Her story, which emerged many years after the discovery of the boy, was unlike the speculation that preceded it. It was not a vague memory, nor a simple comparison, nor a fleeting impression. It was a narrative, clear, structured, and deeply unsettling. And yet, for all its dramatic impact on public discourse, the story of M remained unconfirmed. When M first came forward, she approached investigators with a description of her childhood that she believed explained the identity of the boy in the box. She claimed to have grown up in an abusive household not far from Philadelphia. According to her, the boy had been known to her during her youth. She described details about his appearance, his treatment, and the circumstances that she believed led to his death. Her account was emotional, delivered with apparent sincerity, and filled with specifics that captured the attention of the detectives who listened. While they remained cautious, painfully aware of the countless false leads that had come before, they could not ignore that her story, at least on the surface, was more coherent and consistent than most. Public interest in her claims grew rapidly. Articles, documentaries, and true crime writers examined her statements closely, trying to determine whether her memories aligned with known facts of the case. Many people felt drawn to her narrative. It offered something the story had long lacked: a potential origin, a human connection, a context in which the nameless boy could be understood. But the emotional weight of a story is not the same as evidence. When investigators began testing her claims, they approached them with respect, but also with the rigor demanded by a case of this magnitude. They compared her statements with established forensic findings, timelines, geographical details, and known facts about the evidence recovered in 1957. Inconsistencies appeared. Dates did not align cleanly. Certain descriptions contradicted the physical evidence. Some elements of her narrative could not be reconciled with locations or documented events. Other components seemed plausible on their surface, yet lacked substantiation from any external source. No records, no witnesses, no physical evidence that could anchor her memories in verifiable reality. Investigators also considered the passage of time. Memories, especially childhood memories formed under stress, are susceptible to distortion, blending, and unintentional reinvention. M may have believed entirely in what she was saying. She may have been recounting experiences that felt real to her. But belief, however sincere, cannot replace forensic confirmation. Despite the public attention her claims received, authorities were never able to validate her story. Major elements remained unsupported. Leads generated by her statements were investigated, but ultimately yielded no new evidence. The case files contain notes documenting her interviews, but not conclusions linking the boy definitively to her account. For many, this outcome was difficult. The story had momentarily offered a sense of resolution, a possibility that the boy's suffering had an explanation, that someone remembered him, that his life was connected to another human being. But in the end, the story of M returned the investigation to where it had been for decades, standing in the space between hope and uncertainty. And yet, her coming forward was not without meaning. Her story demonstrated how deeply the case had permeated the public consciousness, how the image of the boy had settled into the collective memory of a nation, how the mystery was not simply a police matter, but a human tragedy that continued to resonate through generations. The M story became one of the most widely discussed elements of the case, not because it solved the mystery, but because it reflected how intensely people wanted it to be solved. It exemplified the emotional gravity of the boy's story, the profound ache of a child without a name, and the lengths to which people would go to try to give him one. But ultimately, the identification did not come from stories, memories, or recollections. It did not come from theories, rumors, or narratives, however compelling they seemed. It would come from science. Science that did not exist when the boy was found. Science no investigator in 1957 could have imagined. Science that would eventually cut through decades of noise and turn possibility into truth. The next major breakthroughs would not come from witnesses, confessions, or theories at all. They would come from the slow, relentless evolution of forensic technology, an evolution that would begin to reshape the case piece by piece, even when answers remained out of reach. And that evolution would soon lead to the first real turning points in the investigation. For a case born in 1957, long before modern forensic science, the investigation into the boy's identity gradually became a timeline of scientific evolution. Each new decade brought tools the original investigators could never have imagined. Techniques that promised breakthroughs, offered hope, and pushed the boundaries of what was possible. And yet, year after year, each scientific attempt revealed the same painful truth. The mystery was stronger than the technology available at the time. Still, every advancement mattered. Every attempt carried the possibility that the next piece of progress might finally reveal who he was. The first major development came with fingerprinting. Though the boy was far too young to have had records on file, Philadelphia police took his prints carefully, preserving them with the same precision they would use in any homicide investigation. They knew the odds were low. Children rarely had fingerprints in any official system, but they had to try. The prints were sent to local, state, and federal agencies. None matched. Next came dental analysis. The boy's teeth were examined meticulously by dentists who specialized in identifying physical traits. Subtle markers, developmental patterns, wear, unique shapes were documented in detail. Dental experts from across the region and beyond reviewed the case. If any dentist had treated him, even once, the hope was that they would recognize the configuration of his teeth. But no dentist came forward. No records matched. The dental examination provided age estimates, but no identity. As the decades unfolded, forensic reconstruction techniques began to emerge. Methods that allowed investigators to approximate what a person may have looked like in life based on bone structure. Early facial reconstructions of the boy were created using clay and photographs. The goal was not artistic interpretation, but forensic accuracy, to show the contours of his face, the shape of his jaw, the tilt of his features. These images were distributed nationally. People studied them. People cared. But no recognition came. The boy remained unknown. Later, computer-assisted reconstruction refined the process. Digital imaging allowed artists and forensic scientists to generate more lifelike representations of the child, attempts to soften the tension in his features and recreate the innocence he had been denied. These digital models were circulated more widely than ever before, appearing in articles, missing persons bulletins, and even true crime programs. Yet, like the clay models before them, they brought no answers. Then came one of the most powerful tools of the early 2000s, isotope testing. This technique examines the chemical signatures in a person's hair and teeth to reveal geographical patterns, where they may have lived, what water they drank, the regions that shaped their biology. For a child with no identity, isotope testing offered hope that science could whisper what memory could not. When the boy's remains were analyzed, Isotope results suggested he may have spent his early life within a relatively small region, likely somewhere in or near Philadelphia. The findings indicated he had not traveled extensively in the years before his death. This provided valuable context. It reinforced the idea that he was likely local, not a child transported from afar. But isotope analysis could not name him. It could only narrow the map of his life. The boy's case became a symbol in forensic circles, a sobering reminder of the limitations of mid-20th century investigative tools and the need for scientific advancement. His story was included in forensic textbooks, lectures, and conferences. Students studied his photographs, his evidence list, his reconstruction models. Investigators and scientists across generations knew him, even though no one knew his name. In a way, the case took on a life of its own. It became an emblem of persistence, of the pursuit of truth in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. His file grew thicker with each decade. His story was handed from one detective to another, from one generation of investigators to another. Despite every scientific effort, the identity of the boy in the box remained beyond reach. It was not for lack of dedication. It was because the science, for all its progress, had not yet evolved enough to break through the silence. And so, the boy waited, his case suspended between past and future. But the future was coming. Quietly, steadily, the scientific world was approaching a breakthrough that would finally give investigators a tool powerful enough to answer the question no other technology could solve. A tool that would reach into the past, pull out truth with extraordinary precision, and reveal connections invisible to every generation before. That tool was DNA. And when the DNA era arrived, everything began to change.
By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the world of forensic science was undergoing a quiet revolution, one that would ultimately reshape not only modern investigations, but cold cases that had once seemed permanently out of reach. DNA, once an emerging tool used sparingly and with great caution, was becoming a powerful instrument capable of revealing truths that no witness, no document, and no memory ever could. For the investigators who had carried the burden of the unidentified boy in the box for decades, DNA represented something more than science. It represented a chance, perhaps the final chance, to give the child the identity he had been denied for so long. The Philadelphia Police Department, along with partnering forensic experts, began the delicate task of extracting viable DNA from the boy's remains. This was not a straightforward process. His body had been buried for years, and earlier exhumations had been handled with the utmost care but within the limits of past technologies. Recovering DNA from decades-old remains is always uncertain, often dependent on environmental conditions, tissue preservation, and advances in laboratory methods. But persistence paid off. Investigators were able to recover a usable DNA profile. It was a breakthrough, one that earlier generations of detectives could scarcely have imagined. For the first time, the boy had a biological fingerprint that could be compared against databases and relatives, if they could be found. Initially, the profile was tested using traditional DNA comparisons, attempts to match the boy with any individuals already in law enforcement or missing persons databases. These searches yielded no direct hits. The boy was still not linked to any reported missing child. He remained, even in the age of DNA, a child without a documented past. But science did not stop there. As forensic genealogy began gaining momentum, most notably through its use in identifying suspects in cold cases, investigators realized that the same method could be used not just to find perpetrators, but to restore names to those who had been lost to history. This technique was both simple and astonishingly complex. DNA from an unidentified person could be uploaded to genealogical databases used for consumer ancestry research, databases filled with people seeking their roots, mapping their family trees, or learning their heritage. By identifying genetic matches, however distant, genealogists could begin constructing a family network around the unknown individual. That network could then be slowly, meticulously traced backward and outward, generation by generation, until a branch appeared with someone whose existence had never been accounted for. This approach had never been available to investigators in 1957. It did not exist in the 1970s or 1980s. Even in the early 2000s, it was more aspiration than reality. But as genealogy and DNA combined into a single discipline, its potential became undeniable. And so, The Boy in the Box became part of one of the most ambitious genealogical efforts in American history. Specialists in forensic genealogy partnered with Philadelphia investigators. They took the boy's DNA profile, carefully preserved, incredibly fragile, and the only biological map to his identity, and uploaded it to genealogical databases that accepted law enforcement submissions for unidentified victims. Slowly, faint connections emerged. They were not close matches, not immediate relatives, not siblings, not parents, but they were real, distant cousins, fragments of shared ancestry scattered across the country. Genealogists studied these connections the way archaeologists study ancient ruins, piecing together the structure of a long-lost family lineage, one clue at a time. Names appeared, branches linked, lines crossed, family trees grew, generation by generation. This was painstaking work. It required an understanding of genetics, history, geography, and human migration patterns. It demanded patience and the ability to see patterns where none seemed apparent. It also required compassion, because at the center of this effort was a child whose life had been shortened and whose identity had been stripped away. Yet as months passed, hope grew. For the first time since 1957, investigators could sense that the silent barrier surrounding the boy's identity was beginning to crack. Every branch of the growing genealogical map brought them closer. Every name uncovered was a piece of a story that had been buried for decades. Every genetic marker illuminated another part of the boy's heritage. Then came the breakthrough. Genealogists found a cluster of matches pointing not to a single individual, but to an extended family line, a lineage centered in Pennsylvania, consistent with the isotope testing that once suggested the boy had lived locally most of his life. This discovery didn't provide the boy's name outright, but it revealed something far more valuable: his ancestry, his roots, his bloodline. With this information, genealogists worked backward through generations, mapping marriages, births, deaths, and family connections. They narrowed the possibilities, refined the tree, and focused on individuals who lived in Philadelphia in the 1950s. The detective work of genealogy, half science, half history, went deeper. And then, after decades of silence, a name began to emerge. A name investigators would verify. A name that would bring the search to an end. A name that had been missing for 65 years. The Boy in the Box was no longer lost to history. But the revelation needed to be certain, beyond doubt, beyond possibility, beyond hope alone. The next part of the story would carry the weight of generations.
When the genealogical team began closing in on a family line that consistently matched the boy's DNA, the atmosphere around the investigation changed. It shifted from distant hope to something far more immediate, something investigators had never experienced in this case: the unmistakable feeling that an answer was finally within reach. The family network identified through forensic genealogy pointed firmly toward a Philadelphia lineage, one with deep generational roots in the region. As the genealogists refined the connections, the tree narrowed to a handful of individuals, then to an even smaller group. Investigators began to cross-reference every possible match with birth records, public documents, and historical archives. They checked census reports, hospital logs, and family histories. They verified marriages and deaths, tracking each branch until they found one break in the documented line, a child who should have appeared in official records but did not. That missing branch grew more defined. The genealogical evidence supported it. The age matched. The time period aligned. The geographical ties were unmistakable. Still, detectives knew that hope alone was not enough. The next step required verification through direct DNA comparison. They needed DNA samples from living relatives, close relatives, whose genetic makeup could confirm undeniably whether the boy belonged to their family. Obtaining these samples required care, privacy, and respect. Investigators reached out quietly to family members, explaining the decades-old case and the significance of their help. The individuals contacted were not suspects. They were relatives of a child who had been lost to history. Their cooperation would determine the truth. Some responded with shock, some with sorrow, some with disbelief that someone in their family tree could be connected to one of America's most haunting unsolved cases. But they agreed. They provided DNA, understanding the gravity of what this could mean, not only for investigators, but for the memory of a child buried without a name. When the DNA results came back, the confirmation was clear. The boy in the box was identified as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born in 1952 in Philadelphia. A child whose name had been lost for 65 years now had it returned through the combined power of science, persistence, and human compassion. For the investigators who had worked this case for decades, officers long retired but never emotionally distant, detectives who had inherited the case file from predecessors, analysts who had combed through evidence, and genealogists who had spent countless hours reconstructing his lineage, the moment was profound. Some described it later as a shock, even though they'd been expecting the breakthrough. Others called it a feeling of peace they had never experienced before. Many simply said that they sat in silence, allowing themselves to feel the weight of a mystery that had finally given them something solid, something true. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a name that once appeared only in the earliest years of the 1950s, now took center stage in one of America's most enduring investigations. A name long buried in paperwork, memories, and silence had emerged through science and dedication. In December 2022, the Philadelphia Police Department held a public announcement, one delivered with the respect and solemnity the case had always demanded. Investigators did not sensationalize the discovery. They did not speculate. They presented the facts with care, honoring Joseph's life and acknowledging the decades of work that had led to this moment. For the first time, the public learned the truth behind the boy's identity. And with that truth came a profound shift. The boy in the box was no longer unknown. He was no longer anonymous. He was no longer a symbol without a story. He was Joseph, a child born into a family, a child who had lived, however briefly, in the city where he was found. A child who now had a name engraved not only in official records, but in the hearts of those who had carried his story for generations. The announcement did not answer every question, not by a long stretch, but it changed everything. It restored the most fundamental piece of his humanity: recognition. 65 years after he was discovered in a cardboard box in the cold Philadelphia woods, his identity was finally known. A name had been returned to a forgotten child, and with that name, investigators were ready to confront the next unanswered questions,
questions that had haunted the case since the first winter day he was found.
The revelation of Joseph Augustus Zarelli's name in 2022 marked a turning point, not only for the investigation, but for everyone who had followed the case across decades. For 65 years, the central question, the identity of the small boy found in a cardboard box, had overshadowed every aspect of the story. That question was finally answered. But as investigators and genealogists stepped back from the magnitude of the discovery, a sobering truth came into focus. Identification was not the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of the next chapter. The confirmation of Joseph's identity solved a singular, monumental question. Who was he? It proved that the boy was not a child lost in anonymity, but a member of a Philadelphia family, born in 1952, with a lineage that could now be traced and documented. It provided clarity that had evaded investigators for decades. It reestablished his humanity in the most fundamental way, by giving him back the name that should have been his from the moment he entered the world. But alongside this profound accomplishment came an equally profound realization. Many of the most critical questions remained unanswered. First and foremost was the cause of his death. While investigators had noted certain physical findings in 1957, the limitations of mid-20th century forensic science and the condition of his remains prevented definitive conclusions. Over the years, the question of how Joseph died hovered over every discussion, every investigative effort, every re-examination. But identification did not and could not reverse time. It could not reconstruct the events that led to his final days. It could not reveal what happened inside the home or environment where he lived before being discovered. The second unanswered question was responsibility. Knowing Joseph's name did not point to a perpetrator. It did not identify who may have caused his death, whether through neglect, intentional harm, or circumstances lost to time. Investigators had hoped that identifying him would provide immediate leads, individuals who might shed light on his life, his family, and the circumstances in which he lived. But the passage of 6.5 decades created barriers no scientific technique could overcome. Many people connected to Joseph's early life were deceased by the time his identity was confirmed. Others who might have offered insight were elderly, with memories inevitably shaped, blurred, or fragmented by the long stretch of years. Some individuals were simply unreachable, or unavailable, or unaware of Joseph's existence in the first place. Identification provided a framework, but not a narrative. Third, there remained the painful question that had haunted investigators from the very beginning. Why was Joseph never reported missing? This question lingered in the air, quiet, heavy, deeply unsettling. In cases involving children, a missing persons report often triggers the first alarm, the first opportunity for authorities to intervene. But in Joseph's case, no such report was ever filed. Not in 1957, not in the years before, not in any jurisdiction. The absence of that report suggested a layer of complexity, one that investigators could not fill in without verifiable evidence. Was it fear? Was it secrecy? Was it something else entirely? These questions could not be answered without documents, witnesses, or testimony that no longer existed. Identification did not erase that gap. Even with Joseph's lineage established, his early life remained largely unknown. Little was documented about his experiences, his living conditions, or the environment in which he spent his brief childhood. He had become a symbol of the unidentified. But even with a name, much of his story was still obscured by time. Investigators hoped that the public announcement of his identity would encourage new leads, people who remembered the family, individuals who may have seen Joseph decades earlier, neighbors who recalled details that once seemed inconsequential. Some information did emerge, but not enough to reconstruct the full truth. And so, the case, though transformed, was not closed. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli solved a mystery that had loomed larger than almost any other in Philadelphia's history. It brought resolution to a question that had tormented detectives and civilians alike for generations.
It allowed the city to say his name openly, clearly, respectfully, and to honor him as an individual, not as an unknown. But it also cast a new light on everything still unanswered. It reminded the public that closure is not the same as truth, and that solving one part of a mystery can reveal the depth of what remains. Joseph's name restored his identity, but his story, how he lived, how he died, and why no one stepped forward, remains incomplete. Even so, with a name returned to him, the pursuit of answers gained new momentum. The case no longer revolved around an unidentified child. It revolved around Joseph, a boy who now had a place in history, a lineage, and a community determined to understand what happened to him. In that sense, the identification did something profound. It reopened the path to truth. It invited new voices, new memories, and new possibilities. It renewed hope that someone, somewhere, might still hold a piece of the story. Because even after 65 years, the search had not ended, and for the first time, it had a name guiding it forward.
When the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli was finally spoken publicly in 2022, it carried a weight that could be felt far beyond Philadelphia. It was more than a revelation. It was a correction, an act of restoring something that had been missing from the world since 1957. And as that name echoed across press conferences, news reports, and thousands of households, the reaction that followed revealed just how deeply the story had embedded itself into the collective conscience of the city and the nation. For Joseph's extended family, those connected to him through genealogy, lineage, and blood, the announcement arrived with complex emotions. Some learned through investigators, others through the public statement itself. Many were hearing, for the first time, that a child in their own family tree had died in circumstances unknown and had been buried for decades without recognition. It was shocking. It was heartbreaking, and it reshaped the way some relatives understood their own family history. Some expressed sorrow that Joseph had never been claimed. Others struggled with questions of how his absence could have gone unnoticed. Many simply felt grief. Grief for a little boy they had never met, but who was now undeniably connected to them. Investigators treated these family members with care, acknowledging the pain of discovering such truth so late and making clear that their only goal was to bring recognition and clarity, not to cast blame without facts or to impose assumptions where history offered none. The broader Philadelphia community responded with a depth of compassion that reflected the decades they had spent remembering this child. People who had followed the case since the 1950s, some now elderly, described moments of quiet relief upon hearing his name. They had kept clippings, saved articles, or visited his grave over the years. To them, Joseph's identification felt like a promise fulfilled, a vow honored after a lifetime of waiting. For younger generations, many encountered the case through documentaries, articles, and online forums. They too felt the impact of the moment. Social media filled with tributes, reflections, and messages from people around the world who had no personal connection to Philadelphia, but who understood the significance of giving a name to a lost child. There was no celebration, only solemn recognition that something sacred had been restored. Within the police department, the news resonated deeply among active investigators and retired detectives alike. Some had spent years, even decades, working on the case before handing it to the next generation. Others had carried the boy's photograph in their files, their offices, or even their homes, hoping to one day see him identified. For them, Joseph's name was not just an answer. It was a vindication of commitment. It proved that persistence mattered, that science could restore what time had taken away, and that a child who had been unknown for 65 years had never been forgotten. Retired officers reached out to share their reactions, some emotional, some simply relieved. One described the announcement as the moment we were all waiting for, even after we stopped saying it out loud. Another said it felt like a chapter of Philadelphia history had finally turned a page. Yet every investigator, past and present, understood a difficult truth. Knowing Joseph's name did not bring closure to the case. It opened new pathways, new questions that demanded answers.
With Joseph's identity confirmed, authorities renewed efforts to collect information from the public. People were encouraged to come forward if they had memories, no matter how small, of the Zarelli family in the 1950s. Investigators hoped that someone, perhaps a neighbor or a classmate or an acquaintance from long ago, might hold a piece of the puzzle without realizing its value. In the weeks and months after the announcement, some individuals did contact police. Many shared fragments of recollections, snippets of conversations they once heard, families they vaguely remember, or events they now saw differently in hindsight. While none of these leads immediately transformed the case, they provided context, texture, and possible avenues for future investigation. The community's emotional response also brought renewed attention to Joseph's resting place. His grave, long marked with the words "America's Unknown Child," became a place of pilgrimage once again. Visitors left flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten notes addressed not to an anonymous figure, but to Joseph. Some expressed sorrow for his suffering, others expressed gratitude that he had finally been recognized, and some simply stood quietly, acknowledging the grief carried by generations of detectives, neighbors, journalists, and strangers who had kept his memory alive. The identification also sparked broader discussions about cold case work, the power of forensic genealogy, and the importance of preserving historical evidence. Universities, forensic organizations, and investigative groups studied the case as an example of what persistence and scientific advancement can accomplish. Yet, through all this, one constant remained: the desire to know the truth about Joseph's final days, the hope that someone, somewhere, would come forward with information that had remained unspoken for decades, the belief that even after so much time, the complete story could still emerge. This hope was shared not only by law enforcement, but by the public, people who had never known Joseph in life, but who now felt connected to him through the journey that had brought his name back. For many, the renewed search represented something more than an investigation. It represented compassion, a willingness to carry the burden of truth-seeking long after the world had moved on, a determination to ensure that the child once found alone in the cold woods of Fox Chase would never again be abandoned, not in memory, not in history, and not in the pursuit of justice. And so the investigation continued, not closed, not forgotten, but transformed. Joseph was no longer America's unknown child. He was a member of a community that refused to let his story end in silence. A community that believed answers were still possible, and that truth, however delayed, was still worth seeking.
In the quiet aftermath of Joseph's identification, a profound stillness settled over the story, one that felt markedly different from the silence that had surrounded him for so many years. The earlier silence had been heavy with uncertainty, with questions that echoed unanswered through time. But this new stillness carried something softer, something gentler. It was the silence that follows a truth finally spoken, a name finally restored, and a child finally recognized. For decades, Joseph had existed in the public consciousness as the boy in the box, a title that captured the mystery of his death, but not the fullness of his humanity. He had been an emblem of the unidentified, a symbol of cold cases that defied resolution. His face, printed in newspapers and reproduced in reconstructions, had become iconic not because people understood who he was, but because they longed to. With his identity confirmed, that longing took on new meaning. No longer an anonymous figure frozen in time, Joseph now stood as a reminder of what can be achieved through dedication, scientific advancement, and the refusal to let lost children fade into history. His name became a light that illuminated not only his own story, but the thousands of unresolved cases across the country that still wait for the same moment of recognition. Joseph's case taught investigators and the public alike that persistence matters, even when answers seem impossibly distant. It showed that justice does not always come swiftly, and that truth sometimes moves at a pace slower than grief, slower than memory, slower than the world would prefer. And yet, truth has a way of enduring. It waits, it lingers,
It calls out across generations until someone has the tools and the will to listen. As forensic genealogy emerged as a groundbreaking new discipline, it offered something earlier generations of investigators had never dared to imagine: the ability to reach back across decades and recover identities once thought lost forever. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli became a landmark moment in this evolution, a demonstration of what science can achieve when paired with compassion, patience, and an unwavering commitment to the dignity of victims. But even as his name returned, the deeper questions of his short life remained. What had his childhood been like? Who had cared for him? What circumstances had brought him to that cold stretch of Fox Chase in 1957? These mysteries persisted, shadowed by time and the absence of surviving records. The community understood that some answers might never come, yet the search continued, driven by the belief that even the smallest truth was worth uncovering. Joseph's story also reshaped the way Philadelphia remembered him. His grave, once marked with the words "America's Unknown Child," now held a name, his name. Visitors came not only to mourn, but to honor him as an individual, not a symbol. They brought flowers, letters, and quiet moments of reflection. Some prayed, some whispered greetings, some simply stood in silence, acknowledging a life that had remained hidden for too long. For retired detectives, journalists, and citizens who had carried the weight of this case across decades, Joseph's identification provided a measure of peace. It did not solve everything, but it solved something essential. It affirmed that the work they had done, sometimes painfully, sometimes obsessively, always with respect, had not been in vain. Their efforts had helped preserve Joseph's memory until the world was equipped to give him back his name. And for the city of Philadelphia, Joseph's story became more than a true crime mystery. It became a testament to the power of remembrance. It became a symbol of the responsibility communities share to protect the vulnerable, to honor the lost, and to speak for those who cannot. Today, when people think of Joseph Augustus Zarelli, they do not think only of the cardboard box or the cold February woods. They think of the child he was. They think of the name he carried. They think of the possibility, however distant, that new information may still emerge, that someone may yet remember something long buried, and that truth may one day reveal the full story of his life. Because Joseph's legacy is no longer defined by the mystery that shrouded him, but by the efforts that finally lifted that shroud. A name returned to a forgotten child, a reminder that the passage of time does not diminish the value of truth, a symbol of how persistence, science, and compassion can converge to right a historic wrong. And so the story of the boy once known only as America's unknown child ends not with answers to every question, but with hope. A hope that his name will inspire others to speak, to remember, and to pursue justice with the same unwavering resolve that brought Joseph's identity back to him. Share this story. Remember his name, because answers may fade, but truth waits for the moment someone is ready to speak.